Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Catherine, Penelope, Rachel, Carol, Jim, and Cynthia. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes heard nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's return to a book about some wonders of nature and relax with more from Wildflowers Worth Knowing by Neltje Blanchan. Adapted by Asa Dawn Dickinson from Nature's Garden by Neltje Blanchan. First published in 1917. Let's pick up right where we left off, in the middle of learning about the orchis family. Let's begin. Yellow-fringed orchis, Habenaria ciliaris. Flowers, bright yellow or orange, borne in a showy, closely set oblong spike 3 to 6 inches long. The lip of each flower copiously fringed. The slender spur 1 to 1½ inch long, similar to white-fringed orchis, and between the two, intermediate pale yellow hybrids may be found. Stem, slender, leafy, 1 to 2½ feet high. Leaves, lance-shaped, clasping. Preferred habitat, moist meadows and sandy bogs. Flowering season, July to August. Distribution, Vermont to Florida, Ontario to Texas. Where this brilliant, beautiful orchid and its lovely white sister grow together in the bog, which cannot be through a very wide range, since one is common northward where the other is rare, and vice versa, the yellow-fringed orchis will be found blooming a few days later. In general structure, the plants closely resemble each other. From Ontario and the Mississippi eastward, and southward to the Gulf, the tubercled or small pale green orchis, Habenaria flava, lifts a spire of inconspicuous greenish-yellow flowers, more attractive to the eye of the structural botanist than to the aesthete. It blooms in moist places as most orchids do, since water with which to manufacture nectar enough to fill their deep spurs is a prime necessity. Orchids have arrived at that pinnacle of achievement that it is impossible for them to fertilize themselves. More than that, some are absolutely sterile to their own pollen when it is applied to their stigmas artificially. With insect aid, however, a single plant has produced more than 1,700,000 seeds. No wonder, then, that as a family, they have adopted the most marvelous blandishments and mechanism in the whole floral kingdom to secure the visits of that special insect to which each is adapted, and having secured him, to compel him unwittingly to do their bidding. In the steaming tropical jungles, where vegetation is luxuriant to the point of suffocation, and where insect life swarms in myriads undreamed of here, we can see the best of reasons for orchids mounting into trees and living on air to escape strangulation on the ground, and for donning larger and more gorgeous apparel to attract attention in the fierce competition for insect trade waged about them. Here, where the struggle for survival is incomparably easier, we have terrestrial orchids, small and quietly clad for the most part. Calopogon, grass pink, Calopogon pulchellus, or Limatorum tuberosum. Flowers, purplish pink, 1 inch long, 3 to 15 around a long, loose spike. Sepals and petals similar, oval, acute. The lip on upper side of flower is broad at the summit, tapering into a claw, flexible as if hinged, densely bearded on its face with white, yellow, and magenta hairs. Calopogon meaning beautiful beard. Column below lip. Ovary not twisted in this exceptional case. Sticky stigma at a summit of column, and just below it a 2-celled anther, each cell containing 2 pollen masses, the grain lightly connected by threads. Scape, 1 to 1 1/2 feet high, slender, naked. Leaf, solitary, long, grass-like, from a round bulb arising from bulb of previous year. Preferred habitat, swamps, cranberry bogs, and low meadows. Flowering season, June to July. Distribution, Newfoundland to Florida and westward to the Mississippi. Fortunately, this lovely orchid, one of the most interesting of its highly organized family, is far from rare, and where we find the rose pogonia and other bog-loving relatives growing, the calopogon usually outnumbers them all. Limatorum, translated, reads meadow gift, but we find the flower less frequently in grassy places than those who have waded into its favorite haunts could wish. Arethusa, Indian pink, Arethusa bulbosa. Flowers 1 to 2 inches long, bright purple pink, solitary, violet scented, rising from between a pair of small scales at end of smooth scape from 5 to 10 inches high. Lip dropping beneath sepals and petals, broad, rounded, toothed or fringed, blotched with purple, and with 3 hairy ridges down its surface. Leaf, solitary, hidden at first, coming after the flower, but attaining length of 6 inches. Root, bulbous. Fruit, a 6-ribbed capsule, 1 inch long, rarely maturing. Preferred habitat, northern bogs and swamps. Flowering season, May to June. Distribution, from North Carolina and Indiana northward to the fur countries. 1 flower to a plant, and that one rarely maturing seed, a temptingly beautiful prize which few refrain from carrying home, to have it wither on the way. Pursued by that more persistent lover than Alpheus, the orchid hunter who exports the bulbs to European collectors, little wonder this exquisite orchid is rare, and that from certain of those cranberry bogs of eastern New England, which it formerly brightened with its vivid pink, it has now gone forever. Like Arethusa, the nymph whom Diana changed into a fountain that she might escape from the infatuated river god, Linnaeus fancied this flower a maiden in the midst of a spring, bubbling from wet places where presumably none may follow her. Nodding ladies' tresses or traces, Spiranthes cernua. Flowers, small, white or yellowish, without a spur, fragrant, nodding or spreading in 3 rows on a cylindrical, slightly twisted spike, 4 or 5 inches long. Side sepals free, the upper ones arching and united with petals, the oblong spreading lip crinkle-edged and bearing minute hairy callosities at base. Stem 6 inches to 2 feet tall, with several pointed wrapping bracts. Leaves, from or near the base, linear, almost grass-like. Preferred habitat, low meadows, ditches, and swamps. Flowering season, July to October. Distribution, Nova Scotia to the Gulf of Mexico and westward to the Mississippi. This last orchid of the season, and perhaps the commonest of its interesting tribe in the eastern United States, bears flowers that, however insignificant in size, are marvelous pieces of mechanism to which such men as Charles Darwin and Asa Gray have devoted hours of study, and these 2 men particularly much correspondence. Just as a woodpecker begins at the bottom of a tree and taps his way upward, so a bee begins at the lower and older flowers on a spike and works up to the younger ones, a fact on which this little orchid, like many another plant that arranges its blossoms in long racemes, depends. Let us not note for the present what happens in the older flowers, but begin our observations with the help of a powerful lens when the bee has alighted on the spreading lip of a newly opened blossom toward the top of the spire. As nectar is already secreted for her in its receptacle, she thrusts her tongue through the channel provided to guide it aright, and by the slight contact with the furrowed rostellum, it splits and releases a boat-shaped disc standing vertically on its stern in the passage. Within the boat is an extremely sticky cement that hardens almost instantly on exposure to the air. The splitting of the rostellum, curiously enough, never happens without insect aid, but if a bristle or needle be passed over it ever so lightly, a stream of sticky, milky fluid exudes, hardens, and the boat-shaped disc, with pollen masses attached, may be withdrawn on the bristle just as the bee removes them with her tongue. Each pollinium consists of 2 leaves of pollen, united for about half their length in the middle with elastic threads. As the pollinia are attached parallel to the disc, they stick parallel on the bee's tongue. Yet she may fold up her proboscis under her head if she choose, without inconvenience from the pollen masses, or without danger of loosening them. Now, having finished sucking the newly opened flowers at the top of the spike, away she flies to an older flower at the bottom of another one. Here a marvelous thing has happened. The passage which, when the flower first expanded, scarcely permitted a bristle to pass, has now widened through the automatic downward movement of the column in order to expose the stigmatic surfaces to contact with the pollen masses brought by the bee. Without the bee's help, this orchid with a host of other flowers must disappear from the face of the earth. So very many species which have lost the power to fertilize themselves now depend absolutely on these little pollen carriers. It is safe to say that should the bees perish, one half our flora would be exterminated with them. On the slight downward movement of the column in the lady's tresses, then, as well as on the bee's ministrations, the fertilization of the flower absolutely depends. If the stigma of the lowest flower has already been fully fertilized, says Darwin, little or no pollen will be left on its dried surface, but on the next succeeding flower, of which the stigma is adhesive, large sheets of pollen will be left. Then, as soon as the bee arrives near the summit of the spike, she will withdraw fresh pollinia, will fly to the lower flowers on another plant, and fertilize them. And thus, as she goes her rounds and adds to her store of honey, she continually fertilizes fresh flowers and perpetuates the race of autumnal sporanthes, which will yield honey to future generations of bees. The buckwheat family, Polygonaceae. Common Persicaria, pink knotweed or jointweed, also smartweed. Polygonum pennsylvanicum. Flowers, very small, pink, collected in terminal, dense, narrow, obtuse spikes 1 to 2 inches long. Calyx pink or greenish, 5-parted, like petals. No corolla. Stamens 8 or less. Style 2-parted. Stem 1 to 3 feet high, simple or branched, often partly red, the joints swollen and sheathed, the branches above and peduncles glandular. Leaves, oblong, lance-shaped, entire-edged, 2 to 11 inches long, with stout midrib, sharply tapering at tip, rounded into short petioles below. Preferred habitat: waste places, roadsides, moist soil. Flowering season, July to October. Distribution: Nova Scotia to the Gulf of Mexico, westward to Texas and Minnesota. Everywhere we meet this commonest of plants, or some of its similar kin, the erect pink spikes brightening roadsides, rubbish heaps, fields, and waste places, from midsummer to frost. The little flowers, which open without a method anywhere on the spike they choose, attract many insects, the smaller bees and drina conspicuous among the host. As the spreading divisions of the perianth make nectar stealing all too easy for ants and other crawlers that would not come in contact with anthers and stigma where they enter a flower near its base, most buckwheat plants whose blossoms secrete sweets protect themselves from theft by coating the upper stems with glandular hairs that effectually discourage the pilferers. Shortly after fertilization, the little rounded, flat-sided fruit begins to form inside the persistent pink calyx. At any time, the spike-like racemes contain more bright pink buds and shining seeds than flowers. Familiarity alone breeds contempt for this plant that certainly possesses much beauty. The troublesome and wide-ranging weed called lady's thumb is a near relative. Pokeweed family, Phytolacacea. Pokeweed, skoke, pigeonberry, inkberry, or garget, Phytolaca decandra. Flowers, white with a green center, pink tinted outside, about 1/4 inch across, in bracted racemes 2 to 8 inches long. Fruit, very juicy dark purplish berries hanging in long clusters from reddened footstalks, ripe August to October. Preferred habitat, roadsides, thickets, field borders, and waste soil, especially in burnt-over districts. Flowering season, June to October. Distribution, Maine and Ontario to Florida and Texas. When the pokeweed is all on fire with ripeness, as Thoreau said, when the stout, vigorous stem, which he coveted for a cane, the large leaves and even the footstalks, take on splendid tints of crimson lake, and the dark berries hang heavy with juice in the thickets, then the birds, with increased hungry families, gather in flocks as a preliminary step to traveling southward. Has the brilliant, strong-scented plant no ulterior motive in thus attracting their attention at this particular time? Surely. Robins, flickers, and downy woodpeckers, chewinks and rose-breasted grosbeaks, among other feathered agents, may be detected in the act of gormandizing on the fruit, whose undigested seeds they will disperse far and wide. Their droppings form the best of fertilizers for young seedlings. Therefore the plants which depend on birds to distribute seeds, as most berry-bearers do, send their children abroad to found new colonies, well equipped for a vigorous start in life. What a hideous mockery to continue to call this fruit the pigeonberry, when the exquisite bird whose favorite food it once was has been annihilated from this land of liberty by the fowler's net. And yet flocks of wild pigeons, containing not thousands but millions of birds, nested here even 30 years ago. When the market became glutted with them, they were fed to hogs in the West. Children and some grown-ups find the deep magenta juice of the inkberry useful. Notwithstanding the poisonous properties of the root, in some sections the young shoots are boiled and eaten like asparagus, evidently with no disastrous consequences. The pink family, Caryophyllaceae. Common chickweed, Stellaria media or Alcinae media. Flowers, small, white, on slender pedicels from leaf axils, also in terminal clusters. Calyx usually of 5 sepals, much longer than the 5 usually 2-parted petals. 2 to 10 stamens, 3 or 4 styles. Stem, weak, branched, tufted, leafy, 4 to 6 inches long, a hairy fringe on one side. Leaves, opposite, actually oval, lower ones petioled, upper ones seated on stem. Preferred habitat, moist, shady soil, woods, meadows. Flowering season throughout the year. Distribution almost universal. The sole use man has discovered for this often pestiferous weed, with which nature carpets moist soil the world around, is to feed caged songbirds. What is the secret of the insignificant little plant's triumphal progress? Like most immigrants that have undergone ages of selective struggle in the old world, it successfully competes with our native blossoms by readily adjusting itself to new conditions, filling places unoccupied, and chiefly by prolonging its season of bloom beyond theirs to get relief from the pressure of competition for insect trade in the busy season. Except during the most cruel frosts, there is scarcely a day in the year when we may not find the little star-like chickweed flower. Corn cockle, corn rose, corn or red campion, crown of the field, Agrostemma githago. Flowers, magenta or bright purplish crimson, 1 to 3 inches broad, solitary at end of long stout footstem, 5 lobes of calyx leaf-like, very long and narrow exceeding petals, corolla of 5 broad rounded petals, 10 stamens, 5 styles alternating with calyx lobes, opposite petals. Stem, 1 to 3 feet high, erect, with few or no branches. Leafy, the plant covered with fine white hairs. Leaves, opposite, seated on stem, long, narrow, pointed, erect. Fruit, a one-celled, many-seated capsule. Preferred habitat, wheat and other grain fields, dry waste places. Flowering season, July to September. Distribution, United States at large, most common in Central and Western states, also in Europe and Asia. Allons, allons, sowed cockle, reaped no corn, exclaims Byron in Love's Labours Lost. Evidently the farmers even in Shakespeare's day counted this brilliant blossom the pest it has become in many of our own grain fields, just as it was in ancient times, when Job, after solemnly protesting his righteousness, called on his own land to bear record against him if his words were false. Let thistles grow instead of wheat, and cockle instead of barley, he cried, according to James the First translators, but the noisome weeds of the original text seem to indicate that these good men were more anxious to give the English people an adequate conception of Job's willingness to suffer for his honor's sake than to translate literally. Possibly the cockle grew in southern Asia in Job's time. Today its range is north. Starry campion, Silene stellata. Flowers, white, about 1/2 inch broad, loosely clustered in a showy pyramidal panicle. Calyx bell-shaped, swollen, 5-toothed, sticky. 5 fringed and clawed petals, 10 long exerted stamens, 3 styles. Stem, erect, leafy, 2 to 3½ feet tall, rough hairy. Leaves, oval, tapering to a point, 2 to 4 inches long, seated in whorls of 4 around stem or loose ones opposite. Preferred habitat: woods, shady banks. Flowering season: June to August. Distribution: Rhode Island westward to Mississippi, south to the Carolinas and Arkansas. Feathery white panicles of the starry campion, whose protruding stamens and fringed petals give it a certain fleeciness, are dainty enough for spring. By midsummer we expect plants of ranker growth and more gaudy flowers. To save the nectar in each deep tube for the moths and butterflies which cross-fertilize all this tribe of night and day blossoms, most of them, and the campions are notorious examples, spread their calyces, and some their pedicels as well, with a sticky substance to entrap little crawling pilferers. Although a popular name for the genus is catchfly, it is usually the ant that is glued to the viscid parts, for the fly that moves through the air alights directly on the flower. It is too short-lipped to suck. An ant catching its feet on the miniature lime twig at first raises one foot after another and draws it through its mouth, hoping to rid it of the sticky stuff, but only with the result of gluing up its head and other parts of the body. In 10 minutes all the pathetic struggles are ended. Let no one guilty of torturing flies to death on sticky paper condemn the Silines. Wild pink or catchfly, Silene pennsylvanica or Silene caroliniana. Flowers: rose pink, deep or very pale, about 1 inch broad on slender footstalks in terminal clusters. Calyx tubular, 5-toothed, much enlarged in fruit, sticky. 5 petals with claws enclosed in calyx, wedge-shaped above, slightly notched. Stamens 10. Pistil with 3 styles. Stem 4 to 10 inches high, hairy, sticky above, growing in tufts. Leaves: basal ones spatulate, 2 or 3 pairs of lance-shaped smaller leaves seated on stem. Preferred habitat: dry, gravelly, sandy, or rocky soil. Flowering season: April to June. Distribution: New England south to Georgia, westward to Kentucky. Fresh, dainty, and innocent looking as spring herself are these bright flowers. Alas, for the tiny creatures that try to climb up the rosy tufts to pilfer nectar. They and their relatives are not so innocent as they appear. While the little crawlers are almost within reach of the cup of sweets, their feet are gummed to the viscid matter that coats it, and here their struggles end, as flies do on the sticky fly paper, or birds on limed twigs. A naturalist counted 62 little corpses on the sticky stem of a single pink. All this tragedy to protect a little nectar for the butterflies, which, in sipping it, transfer the pollen from one flower to another, and so help them to produce the most beautiful and robust offspring. Soapwort, bouncing bet, hedge pink, bruisewort, old maid's pink, or fuller's herb. Saponaria officinalis. Flowers, pink or whitish, fragrant, about 1 inch broad, loosely clustered at end of stem, also sparingly from axils of upper leaves. Calyx tubular, 5-toothed, about 3/4 inch long. 5 petals, the claws inserted in deep tube. Stamens 10 in 2 sets. 1 pistil with 2 styles. Flowers frequently double. Stem 1 to 2 feet high, erect, stout, sparingly branched, leafy. Leaves opposite, acutely oval, 2 to 3 inches long, about 1 inch wide, 3 to 5 ribbed. Fruit, an oblong capsule, shorter than calyx, opening at top by 4 short teeth or valves. Preferred habitat, roadsides, banks, and waste places. Flowering season, June to September. Distribution, generally common, naturalized from Europe. A stout, buxom, exuberantly healthy lassie among flowers is Bouncing Bet, who long ago escaped from gardens whither she was brought from Europe and ran wild beyond colonial farms to roadsides, along which she has traveled over nearly our entire area. Underground runners and abundant seed soon form thrifty colonies. This plant, to which our grandmothers ascribed healing virtues, makes a cleansing soap-like lather when its bruised leaves are agitated in water. The purslane family, Portulaceae. Spring beauty, Claytonia. Claytonia virginica. Flowers, white veined with pink or all pink, the veinings of deeper shade, on curving slender pedicels, several borne in a terminal loose raceme, the flowers mostly turned one way, second. Calyx of 2 ovate sepals. Corolla of 5 petals, slightly united by their bases. 5 stamens, 1 inserted on base of each petal, the style 3-cleft. Stem weak, 6 to 12 inches long, from a deep tuberous root. Leaves opposite above, linear to lance-shaped, shorter than basal ones, which are 3 to 7 inches long, breadth variable. Preferred habitat, moist woods, open groves, low meadows. Flowering season, March to May. Distribution, Nova Scotia and far westward, south to Georgia and Texas. Very early in the spring, a race is run with the hepatica, arbutus, adder's tongue, bloodroot, squirrel corn, and anemone for the honor of being the earliest wild flower. And although John Burroughs and Dr. Abbott have had the exceptional experience of finding the Claytonia even before the hepatica, certainly the earliest spring blossom worthy the name in the Middle and New England states. Of course, the rank skunk cabbage, whose name is snobbishly excluded from the list of fair competitors, has quietly opened dozens of minute florets in its incurved horn before the others have even started. The water lily family, Nymphaceae. Large yellow pond or water lily, cow lily, or spatterdock. Nymphaea advena or Nufar advena. Flowers, yellowish or greenish outside, rarely purple tinged, round, depressed, 1½ to 3½ inches across. Sepals 6, unequal, concave, thick, fleshy. Petals stamen-like, oblong, fleshy, short. Stamens very numerous, in 5 to 7 rows. Pistil compounded of many carpels, its stigmatic disc pale red or yellow, with 12 to 24 rays. Leaves, floating or some immersed, large, thick, sometimes a foot long, egg-shaped or oval, with a deep cleft at base, the lobes rounded. Preferred habitat, standing water, ponds, slow streams. Flowering season, April to September. Distribution, Rocky Mountains eastward, south to the Gulf of Mexico, north to Nova Scotia. Comparisons were ever odious. Because the yellow water lily has the misfortune to claim relationship with the sweet-scented white species, must it never receive its just meed of praise. Hiawatha's canoe, let it be remembered, floated on the river like a yellow leaf in autumn, like a yellow water lily. But even those who admire Longfellow's lines see less beauty in the golden flower bowls, floating among the large, lustrous, leathery leaves. Sweet-scented white water lily, pond lily, water nymph, water cabbage, Castalia odorata or Nymphea odorata. Flowers, pure white or pink tinged, rarely deep pink, solitary, 3 to 8 inches across, deliciously fragrant, floating. Calyx of 4 sepals, green outside. Petals of indefinite number, overlapping in many rows, and gradually passing into an indefinite number of stamens. Outer row of stamens with petaloid filaments and short anthers. The inner yellow stamens with slender filaments and elongated anthers. Carpels of indefinite number, united into a compound pistil, with spreading and projecting stigmas. Leaves, floating, nearly round, slit at bottom, shining green above, reddish and more or less hairy below, 4 to 12 inches across, attached to petiole at center of lower surface. Petioles and peduncles round and rubber-like, with 4 main air channels. Rootstock, not true stem, thick, simple, or with few branches, very long. Preferred habitat, still water, ponds, lakes, slow streams. Flowering season, June to September. Distribution, Nova Scotia to Gulf of Mexico and westward to the Mississippi. Sumptuous queen of our native aquatic plants, of the royal family to which the gigantic Victoria Regia of Brazil belongs, and all the lovely rose, lavender, blue, and golden exotic water lilies in the fountains of our city parks. To her, man, beast, and insect pay grateful homage. In Egypt, India, China, Japan, Persia, and Asiatic Russia, how many millions have bent their heads in adoration of her relative, the sacred lotus. From its center, Brahma came forth. Buddha, too, whose symbol is the lotus, first appeared floating on the mystic flower, Nelumbo Nelumbo. Happily, the lovely pink or white sacred bean or rose lily of the Nile, often cultivated here, has been successfully naturalized in ponds about Bordentown, New Jersey, and maybe elsewhere. If he who planteth a tree is greater than he who taketh a city, that man should be canonized who introduces the magnificent wild flowers of foreign lands to our area of nature's garden. The crowfoot family, Ranunculaceae. Common meadow buttercup, tall crowfoot, kingcups, cuckoo flower, gold cups, butterflowers, blister flowers, Ranunculus acris. Flowers, bright, shining yellow, about 1 inch across, numerous, terminating long, slender footstalks. Calyx of 5 spreading sepals. Corolla of 5 petals. Yellow stamens and carpels. Stem, erect, branched above. Hairy, sometimes nearly smooth. 2 to 3 feet tall from fibrous roots. Leaves in a tuft from the base, long petioled, of 3 to 7 divisions cleft into numerous lobes. Stem leaves nearly sessile, distant, 3-parted. Preferred habitat: meadows, fields, roadsides, grassy places. Flowering season, May to September. Distribution: naturalized from Europe and Canada and the United States, most common north. What youngster has not held these shining golden flowers under his chin to test his fondness for butter? Dandelions and marsh marigolds may reflect their color in his clear skin too, but the buttercup is every child's favorite. When cuckoo buds of yellow hue do paint the meadows with delight, daisies, pink clover, and waving timothy bear them company here, not the daisies pied, violets, and lady smocks of Shakespeare's England. How incomparably beautiful are our own meadows in June, but the glitter of the buttercup, which is as nothing to the glitter of a gold dollar in the eyes of a practical farmer, fills him with wrath when this immigrant takes possession of his pastures. Cattle will not eat the acrid, caustic plant, a sufficient reason for most members of the Ranunculaceae to stoop to the low trick of secreting poisonous or bitter juice. Self-preservation leads a cousin, the garden monkshood, even to murderous practices. Since children will put everything within reach into their mouths, they should be warned against biting the buttercup stem and leaves that are capable of raising blisters. Beggars use the juice to produce sores upon their skin, says Mrs. Creevy. A designer might employ these exquisitely formed leaves far more profitably. By having its nourishment thriftily stored up underground all winter, the bulbous buttercup, Ranunculus bulbosus, is able to steal a march on its fibrous-rooted sister that must accumulate hers all spring. Consequently, it is first to flower, coming in early May and lasting through June. It is a low and generally more hairy plant, but closely resembling the tall buttercup in most respects, and like it, a naturalized European immigrant, now thoroughly at home in fields and roadsides in most sections of the United States and Canada. Commonest of the early buttercups is the tufted species, Ranunculus fascicularis, a little plant seldom a foot high, found in the woods and on rocky hillsides from Texas and Manitoba east to the Atlantic, flowering in April or May. The long-stalked leaves are divided into from 3 to 5 parts. The bright yellow flowers, with rather narrow, distant petals, measure about an inch across. They open sparingly, usually only 1 or 2 at a time on each plant, to favor pollination from one another. Scattered patches of the swamp or marsh buttercup, Ranunculus septentrionalis, brighten low, rich meadows also with their large, satiny yellow flowers, whose place in the botany even the untrained eye knows at sight. The smooth, spreading plant sometimes takes root at the joints of its branches and sends forth runners, but the stems mostly ascend. The large, lower mottled leaves are raised well out of the wet or above the grass on long petioles. They have 3 divisions, each lobed and cleft. From Georgia and Kentucky far northward, this buttercup blooms from April to July, opening only a few flowers at a time, a method which may make it less showy, but more certain to secure cross-pollination between distinct plants. Tall meadow rue, the Lictrum polygamum, or the Lictrum cornuti. Flowers, greenish-white, the calyx of 4 or 5 sepals falling early. No petals, numerous white, thread-like, green-tipped stamens spreading in feathery tufts, borne in large, loose, compound terminal clusters, 1 foot long or more. Stem, stout, erect, 3 to 11 feet high, leafy, branching above. Leaves arranged in threes, compounded of various shaped leaflets, the lobes pointed or rounded, dark above, paler below. Preferred habitat, open sunny swamps, beside sluggish water and low meadows. Flowering season, July to September. Distribution, Quebec to Florida, westward to Ohio. Masses of these soft, feathery flowers, towering above the ranker growth of midsummer, possess an unseasonable, ethereal, chaste, spring-like beauty. On some plants the flowers are fleecy white and exquisite. Others again are dull and coarser. Why is this? Because these are what botanists term polygamous flowers, i.e., some of them are perfect, containing both stamens and pistils. Some are male only, others again are female. Naturally, an insect, like ourselves, is first attracted to the more beautiful male blossoms, the pollen bearers, and of course it transfers the vitalizing dust to the dull pistillate flowers visited later. But the meadow rue, which produces a superabundance of very light, dry pollen, easily blown by the wind, is often fertilized through that agent also, just as grasses, plantains, sedges, birches, oaks, pines, and all cone-bearing trees are. As might be expected, a plant which has not yet ascended the evolutionary scale high enough to economize its pollen by making insects carry it, invariably overtops surrounding vegetation to take advantage of every breeze that blows. The early meadow rue, the Lictrum dioicum, found blooming in open rocky woods during April and May, from Alabama northward to Labrador and westward to Missouri, grows only 1 or 2 feet high, and like its tall sister, bears fleecy, greenish-white flowers, the staminate and the pistillate ones on different plants. And with that riveting information, I think we'll end this evening's reading of Wildflowers Worth Knowing by Neltje Blanchan. The book I'm reading from has some beautiful illustrations of these flowers, and it's nice to actually put a name to some things I've seen on the roadside. I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see those illustrations, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.